Sunday, October 27, 2024. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News. Our guest today is the author of 10 books, most recently Trumpocracy and Trumpocalypse. He's a former speechwriter for President George W. Bush and is now staff writer at The Atlantic. David Frum, welcome back to the Weekend Show.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So, interesting times, 9 days away from this special general election. I'm calling it a special general election, and I'll explain why, because you, as an example, have always described yourself as a conservative Republican, and yet looking at your recent articles, certainly over the last year or so, you, like many conservatives, have felt a calling to call out Donald Trump as an illegitimate candidate for president. So, my first question really is, why have you and so many others felt the need to put your personal politics aside just this once?
Well, I am still a registered Republican in the District of Columbia. If I lived, as you are blessed to do, in the state of California or some similar place, I'm sure I would be active in state-level Republican politics. I'm a believer in markets. I'm a believer in limited government. I'm a believer in taxation that is favorable to business activity. But I'm a believer in free trade and in strong and in American global leadership. On the issues I've cared about most through my political life, I have always stood against people who denigrated the United States, who despised allies, who who pandered to dictatorships, and who tried to bust apart the ties of commerce between nation and nation. So one of those is now at the head of the Republican Party. So some of my Republican friends would say, "Why have you changed so much?" And I'd say, "Why have you changed so much?" Everything I went into politics to oppose in the late 1970s and early 1980s is now coming from Donald Trump. So of course I oppose all of that still. My little faction of American politics, I don't think we're huge, but there is a mean joke that the Trump people circulated in 2017 where they would say, "Never Trump is not a political party, it's a dinner party." And sometimes the suggestion was that it was a dinner party that met in my house. But what we have seen is that that faction of the electorate that is Republican-leaning but can't stand Donald Trump, won't accept him, may be the most decisive bloc in this election, which is why Vice President Harris has campaigned so often in the company of former Congresswoman Liz Cheney.
But does that mean that you and people like you will be voting for Kamala Harris, or will you just not be voting at all? I mean, this is the issue, isn't it? It's actually making those conversions for the sake of democracy, but also humanity, some might argue.
Yeah. Well, I would say to any of my friends, if they are considering a Trump vote and they just don't vote, that's a half point that will be registered in your favor with the judge of the world when you go meet him. And if you want full marks, you have to go all the way. But a half a mark is better than no marks. But the important thing is not to vote for Donald Trump. And the other important thing is to send a decisive message that Trump politics doesn't work. And that's why it's going to be, there are many reasons why it will be important that the Republicans lose their majority in the House of Representatives this time. One of the things I care about a lot is I don't trust this House majority to, again, deliver the aid to Ukraine that they waited 9 months to deliver. Speaker Johnson did come through, to his credit, but he's made it clear that if the Republicans are returned, they will not be aiding Ukraine. And even more difficult will be getting peacetime funding. Once the war is won, which I believe President Harris will do, making sure that the United States bears its fair share of the cost of reconstructing Ukraine.
We spend so much time talking about Donald Trump that it's almost so difficult for Vice President Harris to really get the airtime or the column inches because she's not sensationalist. So maybe you could talk to journalism for a moment as a writer, because really the coverage of Trump has given the impression that he is maybe more popular than he is or more capable than he is. And actually Harris has been steadying the ship for the last 4 years, aside from her previous career as a prosecutor.
Well, let's split that question into two parts, the Trump part and the Harris part. I think you're absolutely right that there's been a tendency to overemphasize Donald Trump's popularity. One of the things that will often be said, for example, is when people say about 2016, the polls got it wrong. They said that Trump would lose and Trump won. Well, Trump did put together an electoral college majority. It's true. But he got about 46% of the vote. He lost by 3 million ballots to Hillary Clinton. Now, the American political system is not perfectly representative. The winner of the popular vote doesn't always become president, and that seems to be happening more and more often, and that is a dangerous trend. So yes, by the rules he won, but if the suggestion that there was this mighty mandate, or as Trump kept saying, this historic landslide because he got 306 electoral votes, even though he got 3 million ballots fewer than his opponent, Trump lost in the court of public opinion in 2016. His party lost its majority in the House of Representatives because of him in 2018. He lost the presidency, this time by 7 million votes in 2020. His party lost the Senate because of him in elections and runoffs in 2020 and 21. In 22, his party had one of the worst performances for the out party in any off-year election since the 1930s. We'll see what happens in 2024. But the idea, look, obviously he has this fan base that is willing to buy golden sneakers and $100,000 watches and stupid NFTs. But the idea that this represents a mighty mass movement, or that there has ever been a single day in his political career where a majority of the American people were behind him, that's untrue. Every single day of his career, since he came down his brassy elevator in 2015, more Americans have opposed him than supported him.
Brassy rather than golden. I'm very pleased for the distinction there. Maybe we can then talk about the way the media has kind of run with him, because this is it's a problem with for-profit media, isn't it? That they will often walk towards the shiny light, and Trump has always represented, whether in brass or in gold, the shiny thing in the sky.
Well, let me defend my colleagues a little bit on that point. As the saying goes, the newspapers don't cover the airplanes that land safely.
Yeah. So
Kamala Harris is a very characteristic party manager politician in the tradition of Gerald Ford and Joe Biden. She's not the leader of a mass movement. She's not a super charismatic person. Her skill has always been to balance party factions, to put herself at the center of a movement. Look, if she becomes president, she will come with a less clear record of what she thinks and believes and does than anyone since Harry Truman succeeded Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1945, and maybe even more obscure than his. We don't know very much about what she believes or what she would do. And it does look that she will be more of a chairman of the board type president than a CEO type president, because she's always been a party manager figure. And those are important people in politics, and that's not a fail. As I said, Gerald Ford, a lot of regard for him. A lot of Joe Biden had many successes, but there's a reason why she attracts less attention, because there's just less to talk about. We know less, and she doesn't supply it, because when she speaks, she is much more focused on what she is not going to say than on what she says. And so, yes, it's very disciplined that she avoids mistakes. It's very disciplined that she avoids making major commitments one way or another. And she always balances everything she says. I'm for this, but also for the exact opposite. So whichever of those you like, I'm with you.
But two things can be true at the same time. And maybe that is a problem with our political discourse, is that people are very black and white about their thinking. And actually, there is so much gray in politics.
Well, that's certainly true, but it's also true that to govern is to choose. And one of the things we want to know about our leaders in campaigns, and when you have a more normal kind of campaign, is what choice will you make? And those are often hypothetical, because often the choices that seem important at the time of the election are not the choices that are going to seem important by Inauguration Day. But it's very hard to know how President Harris will decide on the many matters that will come before her. We know less about that than we knew about a Hillary Clinton, than we knew about a Barack Obama, than we knew about a Mitt Romney, or George Bush, or John Kerry. They'd been in public life in major positions for a long time and had delivered a lot of speeches on national issues, or taken actions, or had an executive career as a governor or some equivalent job. Barack Obama had a short career in national politics, but he had written two very substantial books that gave you a very clear insight into the way he thought about things. And they were obviously written, well, the first one at least was certainly written by him, and the second was more substantially written by him than is usually the case for a candidate for president. Whereas Harris's books are obviously written by ghostwriters out of bits and pieces of her speeches.
I just want to push back a little bit, because obviously I recognize the rhetoric that, what has Harris done over the last 4 years? And firstly, I would say, and I'm sure you would agree, that vice president is a very difficult role and a fine line to tread. You don't want to upstage the president. You don't want to shine too bright. But at the same time, Biden really has shown that it is a unified leadership and that a lot of, or if not all the decisions have been made with Kamala Harris. And she does represent his success story over the last 4 years. And very few politicians would have navigated COVID as well as, a worldwide pandemic as well as Biden did for us.
Look, we're a few days out from the election, and I believe, as you do, that it's very important that people vote for Kamala Harris. But we're in a pretty elite bubble here. People are highly committed to politics, and no one is going to not do it because of the things I'm about to say.
Okay.
So I'm just going to say this because it's, of course you're going to do the right thing, but let's do it with our eyes open. So one of the truths about Kamala Harris as vice president is it's one of the biggest. Historically, the job of the vice president was not a very important job in American history. That changes in 1976 when Jimmy Carter picks Walter Mondale, the first modern vice president. Carter had a spectacular career in Georgia, but he had very little connection to national politics. And he was worried he didn't know how Congress worked. He didn't know how the bureaucracy worked. He didn't know how the military worked. So he sought out Mondale, who was one of the most important liberal Democrats in the Senate at the time, to say, I want you to be my running mate. And Walter Mondale said, why would anybody give up an important Senate job to be a vice president? That's terrible because it's historically been a nothing burger of a job. And Jimmy, you look like the kind of guy who's probably going to live to be 100. You look fabulous. So I'm probably not going to become president in your stead. So I will do it, but on these conditions. I want a weekly lunch, one-on-one. I want my senior staff to be part of the White House senior staff. I want the highest level of brief. And he carved out a treaty that made Walter Mondale a person of importance in the Carter administration, which vice presidents just had not been before. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan approached George H.W. Bush, Bush said, I want the Walter Mondale deal. And he got it. And he actually got more than that because Reagan served 2 terms, unlike Carter. Reagan spent the last 2 years of his presidency really setting things up so George H.W. Bush would succeed him. He made James Baker, George H.W. Bush's most important colleague, White House chief of staff. He appointed Bush. The Bush administration really begins almost a year before Bush takes over the formal office of the presidency. And Reagan constantly made it possible for Bush to be a success. Leap forward. Bill Clinton did the same thing with Al Gore. He just gave him assignment after assignment where Al Gore could be a success. He put him in charge of things like airline safety, these are high importance, low salience issues. They're not very partisan. No one's against airline safety. But where the vice president will always be the most important person in the room. And no one will say, let's take this over to the president, because obviously you're not going to engage the president with this issue. Everyone's for airline safety. This is the meeting right here. With the bureaucrats, the relevant members of Congress, the governors, whoever should be there, industry. This is the meeting we decided here. Clinton set Gore up for success. Biden really didn't do that for Harris. What one might have thought is, hey, you're the oldest president ever. You really need to think very seriously about succession issues. And that means you need to be thinking about how do you make your vice president look good. So you don't put them in charge of the most contentious issue in the government, immigration, where everyone's going to know everything Harris says is provisional. The president will always have the final word over the most contentious issue. You should have put her in charge of something, you should have put her in charge of infrastructure, something where she could succeed and where she could have gone when it came her time to go to the voters, she would say, I did this, go to the voters, I did this. And Biden didn't do that because as the oldest president ever, he was not willing to face the reality of mortality. The very thing he should have faced was the thing he refused to face. And so he put her in a position where she is not going to the public as George H.W. Bush or as Al Gore did with this record, and I'm an important person and my people are in all the meetings. It's not true. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't go vote for her. You should go vote for her because the alternative is the end of the American century and, fascism. But did Biden do right by her as vice president? He did not. And does that mean she's coming into office, if she does, as a bigger question mark than anybody since Truman? Yes, it does.
So do you think that he felt that by bringing in a female vice president, he'd done enough, or a female vice president of color, that he'd done enough? Do you think that maybe those were the boxes that he felt he was checking? Because I'm convinced that behind the scenes, there was a lot of unity with them. And I think that a lot of the negativity surrounding their relationship has just come from the media or social media. I don't actually see that. I believe she genuinely loves him, and that feeling is mutual.
Look, I'm just speculating here because I don't have any special insight. But I think that one of the reasons she got the job was because she attacked him at the debate about his record on race. By appointing her, by choosing her, Biden both looked magnanimous, and he also, in his own mind, settled a question that had bothered him. So he took the person who'd run at him most. I remember watching that debate and thinking, that is a very bold gamble she just took. And that's a bet on Biden's character and his need to look magnanimous. That if you attack him, because she knew at that point she wasn't going to win, but if you attack him, you'd certainly bring yourself to his attention in a way that some candidates for president would never forgive, but that this candidate for president might want very theatrically to forgive. But there's an old joke about the Jewish mother with the wayward son who says, I'll forget it, Sheldon, and you'll forget it, Sheldon, but I won't forget it, Sheldon, and don't you forget it, Sheldon? And I think there's always a little of that in the Biden-Harris relationship. They didn't quite forget the run she'd taken at him. And then there was the fact, and he was surrounded by people who would say, you're not getting any younger, Joe. And every time they said that, he would get more balky. And so it was not a positive president-vice president relationship in the way that there were some others. And that has been an impediment for her because it should have been possible. The way when Gore ran in 2000, and you said, well, what did you do? Well, Gore had the airline safety dossier, and there had been some fatal plane crashes in the 1990s, and civil aviation became much safer after the Gore commission or whatever it was delivered its report. He was in charge of the Russia file at a time when that was a much less important. The president did China and Yugoslavia and the Middle East, but the vice president could do Yeltsin's Russia because it was a lesser problem. And he had deep relationships inside the Russian state. And that was something he could say he had done. And there were other things as well where Gore could say, I did this, this, and this. H.W. Bush could do the same. That's the sort of thing you need to give your running mate if you're thinking about the future. But Biden refused to think about it. And all of that means that when you vote for her, as you should, you have less information than voters for.
Well, I wanted to make that reference to the phrase. It's not a phrase that I like, and that is low information voter. And if we put low information voter over here and then name recognition over here, these are two phrases used in polling. And it's very much the case that Donald Trump obviously has name recognition through his star quality associated with being the host of The Apprentice for so long. And of course, we had the former marketing manager of The Apprentice come out on TV in the last few days and apologize for creating the image of somebody who was a successful businessman in Donald Trump when he was a failed businessman, and that it was the TV show that people are actually still think they're voting for in 2016 and maybe this time too. So is Kamala Harris's name recognition more of a problem than actually her record?
I am told by people who study these things, I don't know it myself, but I'm told that at any given moment, half the American population cannot name the serving vice president. So even a serving vice president doesn't have the name recognition that you would think. And so one of the projects that the Harris campaign has had over the past few weeks that her campaign has lasted is to make Americans acquainted that you would think they would all know who the vice president was, but you would be surprised. About half of them couldn't identify Biden's vice president. Half of them couldn't identify anybody's vice president. So she has that problem. And then even people like the people who listen to you who are very high information voters, they know inescapably, they know less about her than they would have known about Mike Pence. If he had succeeded Donald Trump, then they would have known about Joe Biden when and if he had succeeded Barack Obama. I mean, just because they had much more of a public profile. Harris has been a very cautious politician through her public career, very risk averse. And she took a series of risks in 2019 and 2020 when she courted the progressive wing of the party. And those risks spectacularly backfired on her, and she's suffering for them now. And I think the lesson she learned from that first campaign is do not commit yourself. And so she has been very careful about not committing herself.
The other thing is that she's been very much tied to the Senate with her deciding vote as vice president, which has prevented her from being able to get out and maybe do things because it's a very, it's so...
It was a 50-50 Senate.
It's a 50-50 Senate. So she really has been, handcuffed to Capitol Hill. I mean, that is a problem as well, isn't it?
Yeah, that's certainly, that has meant that she's had less control of her schedule and time than a person in that role might otherwise have had. You can't jet off to the Munich Security Council to give your major speech on global security if at any given moment the budget depends on you being there to cast a vote at 2 a.m,
right?
To expedite things through the Senate. Or Biden had this extraordinary success in getting judges through the Senate, a 50-50 Senate, and a lot of the times the 51st vote was delivered by the vice president, and sometime when she probably wished she were doing something else than getting the Senate to approve judges, which the Senate should do, in a non-party line way anyway.
But Trump has tried to paint her as evil, and he's even called her mentally unstable, ironically. And there is a lot of noise coming from that Trump movement that she is dangerous and evil. Obviously, a lot of that is projection. If I was able to use a Star Wars reference, I very much see the Republican Party as the evil empire and the Democrats as the rebellion against the empire. And do you think it's as simple as good against evil in this race? Do people know that Kamala Harris represents goodness? I mean, she is a former DA, she's a prosecutor, she's a law enforcer, and she's up against a convicted felon. I mean, It should be a very clear decision to make.
Look, American elections, and maybe it's always been this way, but it's certainly this way now, are great culture wars. Clashes that are really not about issues. Look, Donald Trump has been on every side of almost every issue in public life. He's been for immigration, he's been against it. He's been for abortion, he's been against it. He's been for gay rights, he's been against gay rights. He has very obviously no opinions about budgetary issues at all. He has no opinion one way or the other about healthcare. He's willing to do anything. He has, at one point he talked about that he was willing to lead a campaign to abolish AR-15s, the weapon that is so often used in school shooting, and he changed his mind about that. He's got the only conviction that he's got that has been consistent through his life is he believes that life is a struggle for dominance, that there is no such thing as a mutually beneficial relationship. You're a winner or a loser. It's the sucker. You're either suckering somebody or being suckered. That's why he's against trade, because he can't imagine that you could have a transaction where at the end of it, the people who are selling the wheat to buy the olive oil and the people who are selling the olive oil to buy the wheat both walk away satisfied with their bargain, because it's better to have some wheat and some olive oil and some olive oil and some wheat than all wheat and all olive oil. Yeah,
he's never done a deal like that.
He's never done a deal like that, because if he's not ripping you off, he is convinced he is ripped off. And so that, and the other thing, the other conviction of his life, along with, and it is related to the first. So one conviction is all relationships are about dominance. And the second belief is there's a finite amount of respect in the world. Any person's share of respect is taken from somebody else's. And the story of America right now is there's too little respect for the people who deserve it and too much respect for the people who don't. And that one of the reasons he uses insult, it's not just a twitch, although it is a twitch. It's an uncontrollable impulse. He insults even when it does him no good. But every day he is showing to his followers, look, you're told to respect people who you don't think deserve it. I am going to show you that I mock them. And by mocking the people who you don't think I am showing you that I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid to show contempt where you and I agree that contempt is merited. And that way I can arrogate to myself all the respect in the world, because there's only so much. And anybody else's comes from me. And I'm getting some for you too, and putting you back on top and showing the other people that they belong on the bottom. So those are his two beliefs. And so that's what this election is about, is that I think a lot of people look at Harris and they don't know very much about her. They don't have a view. But what they do know is that the coalition pushing for her is a coalition arguing for mutual benefit, and a coalition arguing for, there's a lot of respect. In fact, it's an infinite resource, and nobody's share comes from anybody else's quota. And they don't like that. And so they've experienced her coalition and therefore her as threatening.
The way you just described Donald Trump was far more eloquent than Donald Trump has ever discussed that subject. This one of understanding trade and relationships. So you effectively, the phrase that's being used now is sane washing, giving him way more credit than he actually has, because he's never been able to complete a sentence as clearly as you just did. That is a big problem, both in journalism and in the transfer of information, is that you're making him out. If I didn't know him and you were telling me about him, I'd be like, okay, so he has quite a strong position on this, and he's that, and he's this. Oh. But actually, he's none of those things, is he? He's just like a burnt orange mess.
No, so first, by being able to, so when someone who speaks in herky-jerky ways and is suffering some mental deterioration, when he doesn't express himself well, that doesn't mean that he doesn't have a worldview. And that doesn't mean that and once you can explain his worldview, that doesn't make him sane. Joseph Stalin had a very coherent worldview. It was demented, dictatorship of the proletariat and so on, but you could explain it. Why does Stalin do what he does? I could tell you. And many people who know more about Soviet history could tell you even better than I could, but that wouldn't make Marxism any less foolish and crazy. And so I'm not sane washing by saying in certain areas it is predictable what he will do. In other areas it's not. As I say, that he could say, I'm for banning the AR-15. No, everybody should have an AR-15. That's unpredictable.
But he doesn't know what tariffs are, and that's his main economic policy.
No, but he knows that when free traders say the United States can sell on world markets and buy on world markets, and everybody is involved in these transactions is better off, or else the transactions wouldn't happen in the first place, which is the bedrock of the free trade faith. Trump says, okay, I couldn't say it as pretty as you just did, but I get it. I hear what you're saying, and I don't believe it. By the way, it also needs to be said, this is one of the things I'm hoping for from Vice President Harris. While Trump was the most protectionist president since Herbert Hoover, Joe Biden was the second most. And I am hoping that by Vice President Harris, by having to explain so often what is wrong with tariffs, is actually absorbing what she's saying herself and understanding the Biden tariffs they're less random and chaotic and sociopathic than the Trump tariffs, but they are no less harmful. And there are a lot of them. Biden kept most of the existing Trump tariff structure in place. He added some tariffs of his own. The United States has not opened any new trade agreements. No new trade agreement has been negotiated since the Trans-Pacific Partnership under Obama. No new trade agreement has been ratified since the U.S.-Colombia agreement which was negotiated by Bush and signed by Obama. And the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement that Trump touts so much, was a protection. It made the trade in North America more protectionist, not more open. And while USMCA was kind of the price Mexico and Canada paid for Trump not to cancel NAFTA, it is not the NAFTA 2.0 that was needed in North America, and that I hope a future administration will negotiate. So Trump has some views that you can explain. That doesn't make him a sane person, but it does mean that some of his actions are predictable.
We have to take a quick break, but I want to come back and talk about the F word that nobody has been saying, that Kamala Harris actually did come out and say out loud a couple of days ago, and that is fascism. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. Fall can be a stressful season, and stress leads to feeling drained. And to maintain your energy levels and a heart-healthy routine, it's best to avoid relying on stimulants. Well, Superbeets Heart Chews offer a convenient, delicious, plant-based way to support healthy blood pressure and circulation. Enjoy a heart-healthy boost without the jitters. Paired with a healthy lifestyle, the unique antioxidant compound in Superbeets is clinically shown to be nearly 2 times more effective at promoting normal blood pressure than a healthy lifestyle alone. With a young family, I'm keen to support my heart, and Superbeets Health Chews enables me to do that. Heart-healthy energy without the crash. Support healthy circulation from a plant-based chew without stimulants or artificial sweeteners or colors. Effective and clinically studied, more doctors, pharmacists, and cardiologists recommend Superbeets for heart health support than any other beet brand. Double your potential with Superbeets Heart Chews. Get a free 30-day supply of Superbeets Heart Chews on all bundles and 15% off your first order by going to getsuperbeets.com and using code WEEKEND. That's getsuperbeets.com using code WEEKEND.
There's a lot happening these days. It can feel especially stressful or even hopeless when things are outside of your control. But Calm can help you restore your sense of balance and peace amidst outside chaos. Maybe you've had difficulty focusing, things like parenting pressures or work challenges or school commitments or just a personal drama that can wreak havoc on your ability to stay focused and productive. If you're dealing with a lot of stress, these feelings don't just disappear at bedtime. Trouble falling asleep, waking up in the middle of the night, not feeling rested in the morning, these are all signs that your bedtime routine could use an upgrade. Calm can help you learn to de-stress and fall asleep faster so you can get a restful night every sleep. Calm is the #1 app for sleep and meditation, giving you the power to calm your mind and change your life. Meditations to help you work through anxiety and stress, to boost your focus, build healthier habits, and take better care of your physical well-being. Sleep stories, sleep meditations, calming music that will help you drift off to a restful sleep quickly and naturally. Stress less, sleep more, and live better with Calm. For listeners of our show, Calm is offering an exclusive offer, 40% off a Calm premium subscription at calm.com/weekend. Go to calm.com/weekend for 40% off unlimited access to Calm's entire library. That's calm.com/weekend.
We're back on the Weekend Show with David Frum. I'm Anthony Davis. The fascism word, you mentioned it briefly. I'm thinking about it constantly. This is really a word that leaders try not to say because it really is quite explicit. But Kamala Harris, off the back of the release of this secret recording of Trump's former chief of staff, John Kelly, who's a 4-star Marine general himself, who basically exposed Donald Trump for who he really is, and most of us knew who he really was. And that has given license to Kamala Harris, who denounced Trump as a fascist on Tuesday or Wednesday this week. She said he wants unchecked power and a military personally loyal to him. And he also voiced his admiration for Hitler. And I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that came out in a 24-hour period that should frighten everybody. And yet, is it the right time, less than 2 weeks out, to actually start talking about Trump in these terms?
Many people, journalists, politicians, analysts, have been reluctant to use the term fascism because fascism in modern day speech exists just as an insult. The idea so it's a way of, it just feels like a way of calling names. The idea that fascism is an analytic category like socialism, and that there are many varieties of fascism, as there are many varieties of socialism,
right.
And that you can have fascist tendencies without being fully fascist, or you can be more influenced by, for example, Juan Perón, who was a fascist dictator of Argentina, and who is not a murderer on a huge scale, or even that Benito Mussolini, who brought the word fascism to. Mussolini was a killer, but again, not on a huge scale, especially not before he got Italy involved in its atrocious wars in Ethiopia. Anyway, that he jailed thousands of people and he killed dozens of people, but he did not murder millions and millions until he got into his wars. That's just more history than Americans want. And then it's usually useful to talk about. And so the word fascist so often feels overdone in American politics. And it's hard to explain to people, and I've wrestled with this a lot in my writing about Trump, that when I talk about Trump and Vance as being in the fascist category, I don't mean that as an insult. I don't mean to say they're just bad, because there are many ways of being bad. There are many non-fascists who are bad. What I mean is that actually they have political ideas that belong to a larger family, and this is a tool of analysis. Now, I don't know that I would use it on the campaign stage because it's just too complicated to explain. I'm using these terms analytically and not as epithets. But look, when you have a movement that is culturally reactionary, politically authoritarian, that believes that life is a story of the struggle for dominance, that thinks that cooperation is an illusion, that rejects liberal institutions, and that is aware that it represents only a minority of the population, and so cannot come to power by truly democratic means. That's what we're describing, and the cult of the leader. Like, one of the things that is true of liberal politics is, in liberal politics, leaders are very dispensable people. There are great ones, we admire them, but then their time is up and off they go. Off they go. Dwight Eisenhower gives his farewell address, the hero of D-Day, 2-term president. Your time's up, and thank you. We'll name things for you. We'll build monuments to you, but we'll get along without you, and your successors may be as good or less good, but we'll have them. That kind of functional approach to leadership. This Trump appeared recently at an event where behind him hung a banner that said "Trump is always right." That used to be literally one of Mussolini's slogans, in exactly those words.
It does seem coincidental that so many things that Trump says or words written behind him are word for word from dictators of history. I mean, that can't be a coincidence.
Abraham Lincoln or George Washington would never pretend that they were always right. They'd be, and even if they thought they were right more often than they got credit for, which politicians often think,
but Trump has said,
they wouldn't hang a banner saying so.
Trump has said, and I'll quote him, he said, "Americans who don't support him are the enemy and are a bigger problem than China and Russia." He said, "These are bad people, these are sick people." And then the week before last, we had Trump talking about turning the US military on American citizens during voting. I mean, it's not even like he's trying to hide it, David. Maybe he's not smart enough to hide it, but we have to take him at his word, don't we?
Theologians think in terms of good and evil. Accountants and business people and economists think in terms of profit and loss. Politicians usually think in terms of coalition partners and coalition adversaries. But the central fascist way of thinking about the world is divided between friend and foe. And one of the great theorists of fascism, a German writer named Carl Schmitt, said that this is the fundamental difference. The new thing we are offering is what matters is not right and wrong, not profit and loss, but friend and foe. And if you are a friend, these are defined by these are not terms. You can't become a friend. It's not like in liberal politics where, you're voting. Okay, you voted against me on the ag bill, and you're not a coalition partner then, but it looks like you're voting with me on the farm bill. So now we're coalition partners. We weren't on ag. We weren't on the highway bill, but now we're on the ag bill. So we have different coalitions. That the fascist leader thinks in terms of the identity. Then the foe is the racial adversary or the class adversary or some kind of adversary. And Trump has very much, and his running mate too, who is, unlike Trump, a real intellectual, and a much more intelligent person than Trump, but also someone who thinks in abstract categories. And Vance, when you listen to him and try to decode, well, what's he reading? And he does read. You realize, he's absorbing the full library of middle 20th century fascist ideology, which is not the same as Nazism. A lot of the most important fascist writers were Romanian or Argentine or Spanish. Nazism is one form of fascism and the most bloodthirsty and maniacal form. But there were other forms too, and we thought we'd seen the end of them, but we hadn't.
I want to come on to Vance a little bit later, but let's just stick with Donald Trump and his view that to befriend world dictators, Putin, Kim Jong, Xi Jinping, or Viktor Orban or Erdogan, or there are plenty. And he's referencing Venezuela a lot recently. Yeah. I mean, he doesn't really understand who is the goodie and who is the baddie, does he? And so just try and explain this argument that he thinks it's better to befriend these dictators and then there will be peace, because I think that's a very grey area for his supporters. They have jumped on that bandwagon because it's quite simple language. Why would you fall out with someone because that's going to make your relationship more turbulent? Whereas that misses out decades of history and detail and diplomacy.
Look, wise presidents do their utmost to maintain open communication and correct relationships, even with the most hostile regimes. they understand that even the people we like least in the world, sometimes you have to do business with them. You might be very angry at Russia for its support for the Assad regime in Syria and its many atrocities, but there may be a specific hostage situation where the only way you get somebody out is with the help of the Russian foreign ministry.
Right.
So you have to have those channels open. And a country like the United States has many, many complicated interests, and it often advances those interests by working with countries that don't share its values. And by the way, and where there are conflicts on other things. You can't do everything with Canada, Great Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. You have to work sometimes with people who are a little bit more difficult. That's not friendship. Countries have partnerships, they have alliances, but leaders don't have friends. Or rather, what happens is the friendship emerges. You don't discover common interests because you're friends. Because you have common interests, you become friends. You work on a common...
Like the Thatcher-Reagan relationship.
Like Thatcher-Reagan. And by the way, who fought all the time over important issues. Everything from rules about bringing chickens into the European Union to the Falklands War. The Reagan and Thatcher had many, many clashes. That's because they were each there. They were doing a job. They weren't there for their own sake. Trump thinks of himself as the ruler of America, not the delegatee. He thinks if I get along with this dictator, it's not like he's got the book in front of him and says, okay, now we come to the chicken export part of our conversation. This one's going to be difficult. I've got some hard messages for you. But our chicken people are really mad at your chicken people. And unless we find a middle way here, it's going to have an impact on that's the way that leaders normally talk. And we can then have a glass of wine together afterwards. But, I'm not yielding to you on the chicken point for the sake of your blue eyes. Maybe I'm yielding to you because there's some, submarine basing issue we care about. But Trump really wants to belong to this club. And what he admires about them is that these are not, as he keeps saying, they're tough, they're ruthless, they're murder, they're rulers. Well, the president of the United States is not the ruler of the United States. He's just the most visible and highly placed employee of the United States. And one of the ideas that would break Trump's brain if he ever absorbed it is, you walk into the poorest town, the poorest neighborhood, the poorest street, and find the poorest person, the humblest person there. You work for him. He's your boss. You're not the boss of him. He's the boss of you, if you're president.
But this would be fine if we were in peacetime. But there are conflicts going on around the world that the US is invested in. And whilst Trump might denounce any responsibility for the conflict in Ukraine or indeed in Gaza or in any of these war zones, there are many historians and analysts that can trace much of this back to his misunderstanding about diplomacy, doing the wrong thing during his presidency, and actually connecting him to a lot of these conflicts that he claims he has nothing to do with. Why don't we talk more about that?
Well, let's just talk a little bit about the way that time and space relate to one another. So Russia lunged at Ukraine in February, at Kiev, in the capital of Ukraine, in February of 2022, during the Biden presidency. The Russian-Ukrainian war started in 2014 during the Obama presidency, and many of its most violent years were the years 2017, 2018, 2019. People were dying on the front lines between Russian and Ukrainian forces every day during the Trump, or every week during the Trump presidency. The Russians were shooting down civilian airliners over Ukrainian airspace. So the idea that this war has nothing to do with me, it was raging all during his presidency. Now, he was always on Russia's side to the point where, as Ukraine was battling for its life, yes, before the invasion aimed at Kiev in February of 22, but Ukraine was at war in 2019 when Donald Trump blackmailed Ukraine and said, no weapons for you unless you fabricate dirt against my campaign opponent, for which he was impeached the first time. So the idea that, the fact that it wasn't on Fox and Friends in the morning didn't mean it wasn't happening. And the fact that he was on the wrong side of the war at the time it was happening doesn't mean it didn't happen. In the same way that, the explosion of Hamas violence against Israel that in 2023 and Hezbollah following soon after that, yes, that happened during Biden's presidency. But the accumulation of this war happened during his. And
There's always a delay, right? This is what maybe people don't understand. They think that when a president changes, then time stands still and then the new administration takes responsibility. But there's always a delay of a year or two at least in so much of these events.
And especially with economic growth. Economic conditions in any given year are the result of not of the decisions made that same year, because the United States economy is so big and information takes so long to flow. If the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, it takes many months for that to be felt through the economy. If they cut interest rates, it takes many months for that to be felt. If taxes are raised or lowered, ditto. If a tariff is imposed or reduced, all of those things take a long time to flow through.
Which is why Obama recently is like, of course it was good during Trump's years. That was my economy. Right. And people really need to know that, because this is what they're voting for, aren't they?
Well, the reason Trump became president was we had the worst crisis since the Great Depression in 2000. The crisis struck in 2008, plunged the country into severe recession in 2009 and 10. And recovery from that crisis was slow. But by 2014, the United States had caught up to where it had been in 2008, at which point the Federal Reserve said, okay, we're now back to normal. Let's raise interest rates, which had been very low. Let's raise them back to something more like nominal levels. And that was a mistake. Because the economy was still in 2014 not, in fact, fully recovered. And so we had a growth slowdown in the year in 2014 and the 2 years after. If growth in 2015 and 16 had proceeded the way it had at the pace of 2011 and 12, Hillary Clinton would probably have won. But we had this interest rate rise in 2014, and that took a while to feed its way through. And by the time when the Federal Reserve recognized its mistake and corrected, that produced economic activity that we all enjoyed in 2017 and especially 2018 and 2019 before Trump's authentic crisis, the pandemic, and his response to that struck. And then guess what? When the pandemic ended, we had this global supply crisis as commerce tried to, it's like, when they take off the elastic band from your arm after you've had your blood pressure checked, and you feel the surge of the blood rushing back into the vein. That's 2021. The blood rushing back into the veins where it had been cut off. The commerce surged, and when commerce surges suddenly like that, prices go up, wages go up until the body of the patient is regulated and the blood flows more normally, as it began to do in the second half of 2023. And you're always contending with what is before. That's hard for voters to accept, especially people who have suffered hardship. You're preaching for you don't go talk to someone who's lost a job and talk to him about the theory of economic. He's not going to hear it. I understand.
But inflation was a worldwide problem, and I feel that wasn't really communicated. That off the back of the pandemic, and of course here we have the price gouging as well, which is kind of exclusive to the US, where a lot of these companies continue to charge what they were charging during the pandemic, even after it finished.
Okay, I wince a little bit because Biden, look, the hope of democracy rests on Biden and Harris, and it was very important that they do well. And voters are not always economically sophisticated, and sometimes they believe things that are untrue. And I understand that prices go up because corporations become more or less greedy at time. When the prices are low, corporations are not less greedy. When the prices are high, corporations are not more greedy. Corporations are, in almost every case, price takers. I mean, there are individual companies that have market power, but mostly corporations are price takers, not price makers. And there is nothing wrong with a corporation seeking the best return on its capital that it can. That's how economic progress is achieved. So I wince a little bit because it's so not how things work.
But not during a natural disaster. That's really the point that I'm making, is that taking advantage of a worldwide pandemic. I mean, we saw it during the Hurricane Milton last week as well. Hotels charging $300 or $400 a night for people to move to for a couple of nights, whereas previously they were an $80 hotel. I mean, how is that justifiable?
Well, 200 years ago, a great British economist named Jeremy Bentham wrote an essay in defense of the gouger. And what he points out is there's a hurricane and suddenly there's no ice. So people need a signal that ice is scarce, conserve ice. One way they get the signal is through a higher price. And secondly, people with ice need a signal. If you've got ice, bring it here now, because it normally sells for $1 a bag, and today it's selling for $10 a bag. Bring the ice as fast as you can. And that these this so-called price gouging, these are market signals that tell people that there are emergencies. And that people should adjust accordingly. So again, I don't want to get into this thing because I get it. I get why Kamala Harris has to pretend to believe this stuff. It's like during I think 2021, I wrote an article for The Atlantic that meat prices had gone up. And the Biden people convened this task force on over-concentration in the meat industry, which has not changed even slightly since the middle 1980s. The meatpacking industry today is just as concentrated, no more concentrated than it was 35 years ago. And the Biden people pretended to believe that it was evil meatpacking companies that were responsible for the rise in the price of beef, and then the price of beef returned to normal. Higher prices called forth both increased demand and encouraged reduced consumption. Both curbed demand and increased supply. The prices equilibrated. And guess what? The meat packers, who are no less greedy today than they were a year and a half ago, are charging different prices again. So the stakes are high enough that I don't blame them too much for pandering to public prejudices in this way. But let's not believe that gouging is why things happen.
She said a couple of days ago that she will have a new policy if she's president, where she has laws on price gouging. And I mean, I'm of the opinion that during a hurricane, hotel rooms should be free. So I'm coming at it from a completely different place. Well,
when you say free, you mean paid for by the government, because you don't think the hotel keeper should not take any money for the hotel room.
I believe if we're all in it together, then really there should be, a nominal fee charged to the government potentially, but it doesn't have to be profiteering in these kinds of times.
I'm totally for in a situation like that. Obviously, there's a crisis; the government has to step in, but I don't know why the hotel owner should uniquely step up to bear the burden. And by the way, is the electric company giving him a break? What about his land? What about the mortgage company? Like the way you deal with these things is that the representative of all of us steps in and takes charge and takes care of true emergency needs, and then you let markets work. And I'm hoping that when Kamala Harris says these things, that she understands that as I trust she does, that these are things that need to be said but don't need necessarily to be believed.
But something needs to change, doesn't it? Because the cost of living has continued to rise and wages never kept up with that. And this has been a 50-year problem that, again, low-information voters might want to blame someone for.
This is something else I've written for The Atlantic. One of the things, I'm not, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not a Democrat. And one of the things that I find baffling about Democrats is Democrats hate good news. Because the Democratic belief is you can't. So when you say, okay, wages are now rising faster than prices, why don't you, if that were true under Donald Trump, he would talk about that nonstop. Well, we can't say that because somebody somewhere is sad. And we will seem insensitive or out of touch if we trumpet good news for most people. And so we'll let when the other guys are in power and they have good news, it's good for most people, not everybody. Always someone is sad. That they take credit. But if you believe that so long as there is any trouble anywhere, you can't take credit for good news, then no credit will be given you. So wages are rising faster than prices in 2024. That's a point that first Biden and now Harris should be pounding home. This is the best economy that Americans have seen since the late 1960s. You should be saying that every day and not apologizing for, there's a price shock after COVID. It's now on the wane. Wages are growing. And even gasoline prices are lower than they were. And many other prices, even if the way inflation works is you move to a new price level, but and things stick there. But you don't want to. It's very painful to drive prices down. It's not worth it. You could,
but you're talking about a reality, and Donald Trump doesn't operate in that space. He has created an alternative universe where gas prices are still high, and where inflation and the cost of living is still, at pandemic levels. And he's almost changed the timeline of this whole story.
If he's in that universe and Democrats say right, and therefore, and we can never tell him he's wrong because that would be insensitive to the people for whom life is difficult, then Donald Trump is always going to win. And the way to meet him is to say, when you have good times, say they're good times. And the fact that someone will say, well, they're not good. There's a town over here where a mill closed, or there are a group of people over here who lost their jobs because of technological change. All of that is true. There are 300 plus million people living in the United States. If it's good times for most of them, then you need to say that over and over and over again. Because we have this strange pattern in 2020. If Kamala Harris loses, among the important reasons she will lose is because a lot of people believe, well, I'm doing well, myself, me and my family, and my company, and my state. We're all doing great. And that's, if I'm doing well, that's to my credit, and maybe me and my wife, if the family's doing well, and the governor, especially if he's a Republican, if the state's doing well. But I refuse to admit that the whole country is doing well. And that mismatch is very dangerous. And who is in charge of telling people, the reason you're doing well and your family and your town and your state is because the whole country is doing well. And not only doing well, but doing better than any other peer democracy in the world. So if you don't toot your horn, and if you don't, and if someone says to you, well, a mill closed somewhere, well, that's sad.
I think that's an important point, but there is a selective memory, courtesy of Trump's propaganda, that everything was rosy when he first showed up. And when you hear his supporters being interviewed, they're like, well, my life was much better when Donald Trump was president. That is a theme of this election, isn't it?
2019 saw the peak number of overdose deaths in American history. Overdose deaths have been reduced by half since 2019. Even high information voters don't know that. And the reason they don't know it is because no one's telling them. And the reason nobody is telling them is because and I think there's a unique democratic problem here. Half of peak is still a lot of drug overdose deaths. And every one of those deaths is a heartbreak to a family. And so Democrats, unlike Republicans, find it difficult to talk about the progress that has been made by reducing deaths in half because they're very conscious of the half of the deaths that remain. And of course, we're talking about tens of thousands of deaths. I mean, it is not a trivial problem. And even where we are is inadequate. And it's still more deaths today than it was a decade and a bit ago. The problem is by no means overcome, but you can see progress. And it's responding to very specific decisions that this administration made, which is to make certain anti-overdose drugs available over the counter and be more subsidized than they used to be. It doesn't take a prescription. You can go to a store and buy them. And get them much more, and there's much more production of them, and they're cheaper than they used to be. And those are all accomplishments. But people won't know if they're not told. And the Democratic Party has real inhibitions against telling them that. And people will blame you if you agree on the price gouging thing, that if that's true, if the reason prices went up, it's not because of a one-time temporary COVID shock that is already almost over. But if it's true because there's so much price gouging by giant, well, why didn't you do something about that? And so you're, as a politician, saying, I'm going to blame these price gouging companies. I inwardly know that that's nonsense. And
it's incompatible with free market, right?
So it's incompatible with the actual policies you've had because you know it's nonsense. You don't do anything about it. And so, but people are, well, if it's true that the reason that the price of eggs is up is not because of the working out of post-COVID supply shocks, but because of the evil of the egg farmers or the egg distributors or the supermarkets or whoever's the villain of the moment. And you say, yeah, I agree with you. Well, what have you done about it? Well, not much.
But the issue this time is that eggs weren't up when they said they were. So we even had J.D. Vance standing in front of eggs that said $2.99, and he was claiming that they were $6.99. But there are these blatant errors in the misinformation.
But I don't want to belabor this point, but it's a point I think that, especially for your audience, it's important to take home. The indulgence of false ideas or false explanations then disables you when you counter false claims. Whereas if you said, look, the price of eggs went up and beef and other things went up a lot in 2021 because of COVID dislocations, they are going to begin to come down in the second half of 22 and the beginning of 23. And we'll see some real, and they will stabilize thereafter. And the egg people are no morally better or worse than they were 18 months ago. Oil companies don't get suddenly more moral and cut gasoline prices. They're the same oil companies. Prices fluctuate. And that's not a bad thing. That's your signal to use less, their signal to produce more. And that's how we equilibrate prices. And we're Democrats. We're not communists. We're not socialists. We don't believe that the government should set prices. The markets will set prices. And as a Democrat, what you believe is the role of the government, I hope you believe this, is to step in and make sure that everybody has enough. And no one goes hungry. No one goes without shelter. No one goes without health care. These things are provided. Those things that are truly collective goods are collectively provided, or at least those things that are collectively funded, even if they're not collectively provided. And that's the role of the government. But it's not to boss people around.
But strategically, it's been very difficult the last 4 or 5 years, because not just navigating the pandemic and trying to get accurate information to people about that after the propaganda of the bleach and the shining a light and the ivermectin and all that kind of stuff, but you've also got to counter Donald Trump, who never seemed to go away. It was like he was running a shadow government, trying to counter his daily lies and misinformation. And so, if Kamala Harris and Joe Biden as well are not getting that much airtime because they're not show business like he is, they then don't really have the opportunity to inform people at the level that you're describing, as well as trying to counter the lies that are coming from the former guy.
Well, that was one of the prices that the country and his party paid for the Biden presidency. I agree with you that he was in many ways a very effective president. And especially given the thinness of his majorities in the first 2 years and the lack of a majority in the second 2 years, he got a lot done. Not all of it things I approve of, but unquestionably just by bulk, there was a lot. But what he was never able to do was communicate what had happened. And as his energy faded, he became even worse at it. And that's one of the jobs of the president, is to communicate what is being done and why it's being done. And if a president can't do that, or won't, or can't, or won't because can't, that is a huge problem both for himself and his party. And if the alternative is this Trumpian threat, then it's a problem for the country. And that was one of the prices that America paid for Biden.
We have to take another quick break, but I want to come back and talk about the vice presidential candidate in J.D. Vance and an article that you wrote at the beginning of October called The Vance Warning. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Alo or Allbirds or Skims, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and brilliant marketing, but an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does selling better than Shopify, and the not-so-secret secret with Shop Pay that boosts conversions by up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going. So, if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout that Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/weekend, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/weekend to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/weekend.
Lomi might just be the smartest appliance I own. It's like having an eco-friendly assistant that handles all my food waste. Lomi lets me turn my food scraps into dirt with a push of a button. It's a countertop electric composter that takes my waste and transforms it into nutrient-rich dirt in less than 4 hours. I run it while I sleep, just like my dishwasher. No more smelly bins, and it's so quiet you barely notice it's running. Since I got my Lomi, I'm taking out way less garbage. I used to struggle with 3 full bags of trash every week. Now I'm down to just 1. What I love most is how much waste I'm keeping out of landfill. Less trash means less methane, and with Lomi, I'm turning that waste into nutrient-rich dirt that my plants absolutely love. If you're ready to start making a positive environmental impact and make cleanup a breeze. If you're ready to start making a positive environmental impact and make cleanup a breeze, Lomi is exactly what you need. Head over to lomi.com/weekend and use promo code WEEKEND to get $50 off your Lomi. That's $50 off when you go to lomi.com/weekend and use promo code WEEKEND at checkout. Say goodbye to food waste and hello to a cleaner, greener kitchen with Lomi. And with the holidays coming up, Lomi makes the perfect gift for someone on your
We're back on the Weekend Show with David Frum. I'm Anthony Davis. David, a lot of people are starting to say, I hate that phrase, a lot of people, that sounds very Trumpian, doesn't it? But there is word that, and maybe it's a conspiracy theory, that Donald Trump is a useful idiot, but actually what the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation and the oligarchs want to really do is install J.D. Vance. You wrote about him being a polished debater, and you've mentioned earlier in this conversation that he is eloquent and educated and, all of these things that Donald Trump is not, but he's also a Christian nationalist on the far right who subscribes to Project 2025 and everything that goes with that. Is that what makes him more dangerous?
I've known J.D. Vance, I looked it up, since 2009. In fact, he had some of his first bylines on a website I ran. So I've known him through many phases of his career. And maybe this latest phase is going to stick longer than some of the previous phases has. Maybe he'll change again. The difference between him and Donald Trump, there are some character differences. J.D. Vance has a work ethic. J.D. Vance is a reader. J.D. Vance shapes his opinions in the light of information. And J.D. Vance, although he's got a large and easily wounded ego, he's not the ego basket case that Donald Trump is. I mean, it's not his ego needs and his ego demands they're maybe not attractive. They're maybe not something you would like to see in a friend or a relative, but they're obviously on the green light side of mental health, not the red light side of mental health. Whereas Trump has faded over. I mean, it really is there's. This is non-functional ego wound, ego need that he's got. Why did Trump pick Vance? It wasn't a good pick from the traditional reason of vice president. There are two reasons a president would pick a vice president. One is to help you with certain states, regions, groups.
Allow Mike Pence.
So Mike Pence to reassure evangelicals, or Bill Clinton picked Al Gore because Bill Clinton had opposed the first Gulf War and was worried that he looked too peacenicky, and Gore had supported the first Gulf War and served in Vietnam, so it was a way of bolstering Clinton's hawkish credentials. Carter picked Mondale because he needed an inside guy, someone who knew Washington. George W. Bush picked Cheney for the same reasons, an inside guy who knew Washington. So there are a lot of reasons. Vance met no reason. Obviously, Trump was going to win Ohio, Vance or no Vance. Obviously, Trump was going to win over the farthest right sections of American public opinion, Vance or no Vance. So what did Vance bring? And the answer is, well, Vance was very much advanced by a coterie, as you said, of these very wealthy people with very odd ideas. And Vance had been soaking in those ideas for a long time. And Trump was told by Elon Musk and Peter Thiel that there's a lot of money in it for your campaign at a time when the campaign badly needed money, if you will pick Vance. Remember, Elon Musk is what get out the vote effort Trump has, because Trump stole so much of the money that belonged to the RNC, or that had been raised by the Republican National Committee. He needed Elon Musk's money through Turning Point USA to run his get out the vote operation. And Musk promised very large sums, and Peter Thiel as well, if Trump would pick Vance. And so there we go. He doesn't do any of the things a vice presidential candidate normally does, but he does some special things. Now, as I said, he's not a pathological case like Trump. He is a goal. You'll accuse me of sane washing if I call him rational. So I'll call him, he's a goal-oriented person. Donald Trump has tremendous difficulty choosing goals and then identifying means that will achieve those goals. J.D. Vance does not have those problems. He has goals, and he chooses means that are relevant to those goals. So
he's clearly very ambitious,
yeah.
Right? Because maybe Trump was a little thrilled by the Hillbilly Effigy book and the Netflix drama and the fact that he was in show business, and he also had pressure from Don Jr. and from Eric as well.
That's all possible too. The question. One of the questions that the whole world and the Republican Party has been grappling with is there Trumpism without Trump? I think that remains a big question mark. But J.D. Vance is a bet on the proposition that there exists such a thing as Trumpism without Trump, and that you can turn Trumpism into something like a more orderly system of government, a self-consciously anti-democratic system. Like Trump only cares that me, I'm in charge. Me. The idea of creating an ongoing bureaucratized system of authoritarian government that would outlast him, he has no interest. How does that help me? Unless it's me, it's garbage. Whereas J.D. Vance would think, okay, how do we build an ongoing system that is bigger than me, that will outlast me?
But they wrote it down, David. I mean, if you read the Project 2025, and as Harris says, can you believe they wrote it down? Because it's very clear.
The Vance agenda is much larger, more ambitious, and more sinister than Project 2025 is a kind of tooth and claw version of a lot of things that have been bumping around, increasing the president's direct authority over the executive branch. That's been an idea that's been bumping around for a long time. Good, bad.
But it's already started. I mean, presidential immunity from the Supreme Court, that was part of the plan, right? Yeah. And reversal of Roe and Chevron, that was all part of the plan. I mean, their plan is unfolding.
So, but Chevron, but what you will not find, or whether what J.D. Vance is bringing to it, this idea of we're going to reconceptualize. J.D. Vance, in his speech at the Republican Convention, paid tribute to his 7 generations of ancestors buried in soil, in his native soil. That's not the way American politicians have ever talked, including those whose roots go farthest back. The normal way, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose family went back to Dutch colonial times, famously greeted the daughters of the American Revolution, my fellow immigrants, and said to them, Americans must never forget, and especially not you or I, meaning you and I with the daughters of the American Revolution and the Roosevelts who went back even farther, that we are all the descendants of rebels and insurrectionists. That is the way American politicians have historically talked, that the person who is naturalized yesterday is as good an American as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of course. J.D. Vance contradicted that view and said there's something, if you've been here 7 generations, you're a better American than someone who's been here merely 6, who in turn can lord it over the person with just a lousy 5. And certainly you're all better than the person who was naturalized yesterday. And that's a different kind of idea, not only about himself and about ideology, a different idea of what it means, what America stands for, what America is. And that's much more radical than anything you'll find in Project 2025.
He's a shapeshifter, though, isn't he? Because he was an atheist until 2019. He converted to Catholicism to get the senator position. And we also heard that
he was a supporter of the Iraq War when he wrote for me.
Right. But we also heard that he criticized Donald Trump and said that the guy was vacuous, and now obviously
in our magazine. So as I said, we have this deep relationship. I mean, he wrote for the Atlantic, and where he compared Trump to heroin. In his private correspondence, he compared Trump to an American Hitler. He didn't publish that, but he said that to friends. So he is a shapeshifter. What happens as you go through politics, though, that shapeshifting becomes harder and harder to do. You eventually get stuck in the shape you've assumed. And however cynically or opportunistically you made the move, after a while you can't unmake the move.
Well, it's often the shape that you get your break in, that you have your most success in, that lights the touch paper for your career. That's where you stay, in the same way that Donald Trump remains dressed like he's living in the 80s. That was the kind of peak of his moment. But with J.D. Vance, my fear is it's like a Trojan horse scenario, isn't it? He is way more dangerous than Trump, as you've described, but he is younger and he has more enthusiasm for it. He has a relationship with Peter Thiel and with people who are responsible for some of the most far-right, white supreme theories and actions, and yet he's kind of being discarded as a bit of a lightweight when actually he is quite sinister.
I would be careful of the phrase "more dangerous" because that implies that Donald Trump is less dangerous, and I'm not sure that's true. I think you have different kinds of problems. If J.D. Vance had been president in 2020, I believe he would have done a much more systematic and serious approach to defeating the election. But if he failed, if in the end the election went against him, I don't believe that he would have tried this comic opera coup d'etat, which was obviously not going to work. Because I think he's less emotional than Trump, less impulsive. Do you know the
He's
famous
strategic.
Yeah, he would pass the marshmallow test. You know this test. The psychologists say where you put in front of a 2-year-old, you put a marshmallow, and the psychologist steps out of the room and says, if the marshmallow is still there in 10 minutes, you get a second marshmallow. J.D. Vance would pass the marshmallow test. Donald Trump would fail it.
Yeah. It's so interesting, isn't it, that these different personalities have kind of come together for this election, but you wouldn't know that J.D. Vance was his running mate. You'd think Elon Musk was his running mate. That is how it's now positioned, and there are some who are suggesting that actually, a future Trump presidency is a Musk presidency with J.D. Vance potentially, and because Musk has done this kind of crab crawl into the arena and has government contracts. He's running much of the door knocking for the campaign, which has turned out to be quite controversial, as well as paying voters effectively $1 million a day for their loyalty. I mean, this is dangerous territory again, isn't it?
If Trump wins, I would assume that Elon Musk would have a lot of influence, both directly upon Trump and through Vance. I think it'll be an interesting question whether Vance ultimately betrays Elon Musk. And if I were Elon Musk, I would definitely worry about whether I had the hold upon Vance, a vice president and someday a president Vance, that I assume I have. And maybe he's got, he's obviously no fool. Maybe he's got those kinds of guarantees somewhere, but I'd be careful about that. But I think that Musk is doing that I don't understand is Peter Thiel, who's a much more, it seems to me, goal-driven actor than Musk, understands you fund the campaign, you have a wish list, you get the sign-off, and then you stay in the background. It's just dangerous to be this visible. It's potentially counterproductive. But Musk seems to have ego needs that have nothing to do with his...
Well, he also has a vendetta because of his own children and trans issues, and he's become very anti-woke because of that. And so it's almost as if he can't help himself.
He can't. If you've got tens of billions of dollars, you can pursue your vendettas
without
leaving any fingerprints.
Right.
You don't have to be leaping around the stage like the backup band for Taylor Swift.
But maybe he's just not that smart. I mean, we give him credit because he's rich, but maybe he's not the smart cookie we thought he was.
You can be very smart and have poor impulse control.
You can also be very rich and not be very clever.
And you can also be very smart, have a lot of success, and then start taking drugs every day and have your judgment interfered with. Surely one of the lessons of the Elon Musk later phase is the advice: stay in school, don't take drugs. That's good advice. It applies to all the drugs.
So one thing that J.D. Vance and Elon Musk appear to have in common, and maybe they've come to it from different places, is they're both a little bit racist and misogynistic and have a kind of weird view of society that really kind of replicates The Handmaid's Tale than anything less sinister than that. I mean, that is also the other thing we need to talk about going into this election is women's healthcare and rights, the rights of minorities, LGBTQ plus people. I mean, there is a lot at stake for anybody who's not white, Christian nationalist and male, right?
Well, one of the trends that has been going on, and it precedes Donald Trump, is, I'm just going to assert an observation of mine, you may disagree with it, is in 20th century America, we're seeing the declining political salience of race and the rising political salience of sex. And what we're seeing is that Donald Trump is doing better than many of his predecessors among Latinos and among black voters, especially men, probably exclusively men, than recent. There seems to be this movement of disaffected, unmarried, younger Latino and African-American men into the Republican Party, and then an exodus of better educated people, especially women, out of the Republican Party. And the gender gap is widening. The gender gap in voting is widening, even as it looks like the race gap may be shrinking. I'm not sure I would agree with you in describing Vance as a racist exactly. I mean, he's an ethnic chauvinist. But
is that not a white supremacist?
I don't think he thinks equally well of all white people. I don't think he's got a category. White people, I think he's got like a much finer grid of the people he likes and the people he doesn't like.
Because we shouldn't let having a brown wife be a distraction here, because, those two things can work alongside each other.
But I think the sexual preoccupations, I'm just struck by something that Tucker Carlson said at a rally in Georgia for Trump a couple of days ago. So Tucker Carlson, who obviously is a very bigoted person in many ways and quite anti-Semitic, and he's got many, but he had this analogy of what America needed was a stern father to haul a 15-year-old girl over his lap and give her a good spanking in a way that hurt her more. And the 15-year-old girl he had in mind was described in the analogy as the stern father's own daughter. So this is not just sadistic kink, but it's incestuously sadistic kink. And it's pretty upsetting and reprehensible, but it's obviously, that's an image that doesn't come from nowhere. Like, you start when you're free associating. I'm talking to you now. I don't have notes, and you'll hear, how does my mind work? And one of the things you have not heard from me is a fantasy about brutalizing my teenage daughter. But Tucker has this fantasy somewhere in his head. Where'd that come from? And he's offering it as a model of what the politics of the future could be. And I think sex weirdness is an underrated aspect of what's going on here. All kinds of sex weirdness.
But there is quite a lot of hypocrisy in this arena.
I don't think they're hypocritical about the sex weirdness. I think that's from the heart.
Because we often hear the kind of puritanical language from them. It's certainly, the Mike Johnsons and people who are, claim to be of God. And yet we often discover through legal cases or whistleblowers that actually what's really going on with these people is pretty sordid and completely at odds with their claim of being good Christians.
But as everyone who's written about Puritanism has observed from the great American tradition, like you mentioned Atwood and the Handmaid's Tale and Nathaniel Hawthorne and the Scarlet Letter, the shame is bound intimately to the thrill. If you don't the secrecy is necessary to the harm. I mean, if we're all in the light of day here, the only way that you have such behaviors on a large scale as men brutalizing their teenage daughters in a sexually suppressed way is if they count on the girl to keep quiet about it. If she tells everybody, then they'll, even in any kind of society, even ours, if Tucker Carlson actually did harm his daughter in the way that he fantasized about doing, that would be a scandal even in Trump world. But
look at the way Trump has spoken about his daughter. And said, if she wasn't my daughter, I'd probably be dating her.
But it requires it requires the girl to keep the secrets of what may or may not actually be happening. So the shame is integral to the power. So it's not yes, it's hypocritical, but it's actually there's something deeper and sicker going on, which is, and this has been going on in all. I don't want to single out Puritans. Orthodox Jewish communities, Muslim communities, all of them. That secrecy, shame are tools of power.
But is that sickness attractive to diehard Trump supporters?
Apparently.
Is there a subconscious tapping into that? Because the violence goes hand in hand with that abuse as well. Yeah. There seems to be a lot less value of human life amongst Republicans and the Second Amendment people and all of that.
Look, the Roman Colosseum stood for 500 years, putting bums in the seats twice or thrice a week for almost all of that time, to watch people hack themselves up to death or wild beasts be tortured. The human race does have this appetite for cruelty. And a big part of the project of human self-civilization is to lead people away from that instinct, to put it under some kind of restraint, to show people a better life. And that's a lot of what the modern world is about, is discrediting cruelty. There's this line of the English historian Macaulay's about the sport of bear baiting. He said it was objected to not just because it gave pain to the bear, but because it gave pleasure to the spectators. But actually, the pleasure to the spectators from watching cruelty is an evil too. that you're not a civilized society unless you both protect the bear from the cruelty and also make people think, I don't enjoy this. I don't enjoy watching an animal be tortured. That's horrible. I'd rather see the bear frolic in its natural environment. And up from cruelty is that's civilization. But the call, the thrill of cruelty, as I say, if it weren't true, they wouldn't have built the Colosseum. That was not a cheap project.
We have to finish in a minute, but I want to finally talk about what Donald Trump has said about Jack Smith in the last couple of days. He said he vowed that if he returns to the White House, he will swiftly fire Jack Smith. This is the Justice Department special counsel who's prosecuting him for plotting to overturn the 2020 election and hide classified documents and lie about returning them and sharing them potentially and everything that goes with that. I mean, if this isn't the language of authoritarianism, I don't know what is. Is this really something that, just a few days out from Election Day, people need to take very seriously?
It's also a warning of the chaos and instability that is ahead. So let's suppose Donald Trump, again, gets 47% of the vote. And once again, the Electoral College does its magic. And although Harris has gotten 49% of the vote, Trump is deemed the president. And he's got a Republican Senate. That's almost certain to happen, and maybe a Republican House as well. So he's got temporary control of a united government. And he then says, right, I'm going to use my power as president to shut down investigations in ways that no previous president thought they had legal authority to do. I'm going to pardon my criminal associates, both those who tried to overthrow the government and the people in the Trump end. I'm going to try to shut down state investigations, criminal and civil prosecutions of my various frauds. And again, something no previous president was going to try to do. I'm going to do this on the basis of no popular mandate and see what happens. Does the rest of American society say, oh, well, you've got the Harry Potter cheat codes, I guess we have to let you get... No. We're going to have an uproar. And that the prognosis of a second Trump presidency, if such a thing happens, is chaos, paralysis, scandal, conflict. And Trump may try, but he will be contested every step of the way. And the country will achieve nothing. There will be no progress on any important social goal, including those that Trump purports to care about, like increasing manufacturing employment. And meanwhile, predators and enemies, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, China, Russia, they will all be watching and see not just this great superpower, but this protector of the liberty and security of every allied democracy paralyzed at home under this thug president. And they said, this is the time to bite. And it will be paralysis at home, threats abroad. That's what it means. Trump is not going to have a smooth path. In the way that if he'd known what he was doing better in 2017, he might then have had more success, but he was too ignorant and lazy and self-involved and crooked. So he didn't do it when it would have been a little easier. Now he's going to try it again if he is deemed the winner in 2025 in an atmosphere of chaos. And the outlook is catastrophic for Americans, for everyone in the world who depends on American protection, for our trading partners, for our allies. So let's not do it.
I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, I'm one of very few people that's quite optimistic about this election because I believe that the Trump movement is very noisy, but it actually doesn't convert. Yeah. And everybody else, including people like yourself who are making exceptions just this once, recognize how serious the threat is. And
I made exceptions. This is not just this once. I voted against Trump in 2016. I voted against him in 2020, and I voted. So it's the third time.
So it's a Trump thing.
Yeah, and also one of the great things about being a registered Republican is you get to vote against him in the primary too. So I get to vote him twice as often as anybody else.
But we are relying on people coming to their senses, and the line I've been peddling is that nobody in their right mind would vote for Donald Trump. Now, there's a big caveat in there, isn't there?
Well, people have reasons, and I don't intend to get into people's heads, but it's a bad decision, and we should try our utmost to dissuade as many as possible of our fellow citizens to do it. The good news is that you don't need 100% of the vote to stop him. You just need 50-ish, maybe 51. Maybe you can do it even if the Electoral College gods are a little bit more favorable. You can do it with 49 if he gets 46. I mean, that's the way the system should operate. The person who gets more votes should become president. That's the way until 2016. Like since the Civil War, there were the elections in which the Electoral College and the popular vote deviated were 1876. Well, that was in conditions of post-Civil War chaos. And anyway, it's not clear how many, because there was so much fraud in the South, how many votes really were cast. 1888, where the two sides were separated by a few tens of thousands of votes. And 2000, where Bush and Gore, out of hundreds of millions of votes cast, were separated by, I think, 300,000 or 400,000. They were excruciatingly tight elections. And it could have happened very easily in 1960, Kennedy versus Nixon. It could have happened that Nixon could have won the popular vote and Kennedy would still have won the electoral vote. But always we thought of this as something happening as a theoretical possibility under conditions so close that they counted practically as a tie. But the Trump elections have not been close. He lost to Hillary Clinton by 2 points of the popular vote, 3 million people. He lost to Biden by 7 million votes. And he will lose to Harris probably somewhere between 3 and 7 million votes. If he claims the presidency, this is going to be a crisis of American democracy, because people are going to say, this idea they had in 1787, they weren't gods. It was a stupid idea then. It was almost instantly stopped operating the way anybody imagined it was. That by 1800, they'd basically discarded the 1787 conception. And now it's brought Donald Trump to the presidency after in 3 elections where he lost the popular vote. He will have been president twice. Not acceptable. And so I think
he's not going to concede whatever happens, right? No. I mean, that's a certainty.
But you know what? But neither will his opponents submit to every outrage in a world in which he's lost the popular vote, eked his way into the presidency, and then starts breaking apart the legal structure of the country, abandoning allies, busting up the world trading system. He'll be the legal president. In this scenario, he'll have the right to live in the White House, but he won't have the means or power to do anything he wants, any way he wants to do it, in violation of laws or laws as laws have been understood. There will be trouble. So again, don't do it.
Okay. We have to finish, but for now, David Frum, thank you for joining the Weekend Show.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News. You can see more from me on the 5 Minute News YouTube channel. And I'll be back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.